At 6:07 in the morning on October 3rd, 2024, a woman named Special Agent Patricia Hennessy knocked on the door of a Bay Ridge Parkway home in Brooklyn. The man who answered, a 61-year-old named Vincent Ricciardi, took one look at the badge and the 10 agents standing in his driveway, and he said nothing, not a single word. Because Vincent Ricciardi had been in this business long enough to know that when the FBI comes at 6 in the morning with that many people, whatever you say next will be used against you in a federal courtroom. So he stood there in his doorway, silent, and Special Agent Hennessy placed him under arrest for racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy charges stemming from a 9-year federal investigation. In the next 4 hours, 81 more arrests would unfold across 4 states and 3 countries. 341 agents and detectives, 18 staging locations, 1 coordinated takedown of what federal prosecutors would call the largest construction racketeering conspiracy in the United States since the Windows case of 1990. But here is what nobody was talking about that morning. Somewhere in New York City, there was a man nobody knew the name of. The FBI had called him Source Carpenter in their internal files. He was not a federal agent. He was not a prosecutor. He was a 58-year-old concrete contractor from Queens, and he had spent 31 months of his life wearing a wire into the most dangerous rooms in organized crime in America. And without him, none of this, not the 82 arrests, not the $410 million recovered, not the 22-year prison sentences handed down to Vincent Ricciardi, none of it would have happened. Who is Source Carpenter? What exactly did he record that broke this case wide open? And what happened to the 3 defendants who were not arrested on October 3rd? Stay with me. We are going to answer all of it. My name does not matter. What matters is this. I spent months going through the public record on this case. The indictments, the sentencing memos, the forfeiture filings, the wiretap transcripts. And what I found is a story that is more intricate, more surprising, and more damning than anything the press coverage captured. This is the full story of Operation Clean Field Foundation. This is the FBI versus the Colombo family's construction empire. Let's go back to the beginning. The Colombo family is one of the 5 historic organized crime families of New York City. Founded in the 1930s, restructured through decades of federal pressure and internal war, the Colombos have operated in the shadows of South Brooklyn for nearly a century. Bath Beach, Bensonhurst, Dyker Heights. These are their neighborhoods. These are the blocks where the rules of normal American life have always had a footnote. Certain business gets done a certain way, and you pay the toll or you don't build. By the time the 21st century arrived, the Colombos were not the dominant power they had once been. Federal prosecutions through the 1980s and 90s had done real damage. Bosses went to prison. Captains flipped. The family lost control of the waterfront, lost ground and garment, lost influent garbage. But construction, the grinding, concrete and steel machinery of building in New York City, that they held. And they held it because of a very specific structural advantage. The building trades. New York City's construction industry runs through labor. You cannot build a skyscraper in Manhattan without union labor, and union labor in New York means a set of relationships that go back generations. Organized crime had been embedded in the building trades since the 1940s. Not in every union, not in every local, but in enough of them that a well-placed family could effectively act as an invisible tax collector on any major construction project in the 5 boroughs. You want to break ground? You pay. You want your inspections to pass? You pay. You want your competition to have trouble with their workers? You can arrange that too, for a price. Vincent Ricciardi understood this better than almost anyone alive. He had grown up in Bath Beach, the son of a laborer, and by his 20s he was already running errands for men with Colombo connections. He was smart and he was patient, which in organized crime means he stayed out of prison long enough to rise. By the early 2000s he was a soldier. By 2015 he was a capo, a captain in the Colombo family, overseeing a crew that specialized in one thing, construction. His legitimate cover was a car wash on McDonald Avenue in Bensonhurst. It was called, with no apparent irony, Vinny's Auto Spa. A car wash is a good cover for a mob captain, cash intensive, hard to audit. Customers come and go, and nobody writes down their names. Ricciardi was there most mornings, visible, normal seeming, a neighborhood businessman, chatting with his customers, and occasionally stepping into the back office to make calls. The real work happened somewhere else. 3 blocks from the car wash, on a side street in Bath Beach, there was a private social club called the Bath Beach Social and Athletic Club. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A narrow storefront, frosted windows, a small hand-lettered sign. Inside it was a card room. Men played cards, men watched sports, men talked. Specifically, men with connections to the Colombo family talked about money and construction contracts and what price was fair and what price needed to be corrected. The FBI would later describe certain meetings at the Bath Beach Social and Athletic Club as determination meetings. That word, determination, is doing a lot of work in the federal filings. What it meant in practice was this: if a developer or contractor in New York City had a problem, a competitor bidding too low, an inspector asking too many questions, a union local that was not cooperating, they could come to a determination meeting, and Vincent Ricciardi and his associates would determine what happened next. For a fee, the fee was 18%. That was the Colombo rate for construction projects under Ricciardi's umbrella. If your project was a $100 million high-rise, you were paying $18 million for the privilege of building it without interference, with cooperative inspectors, and with union labor that did not suddenly develop slowdown problems. 18%. On 47 Manhattan projects worth a combined $2.6 billion, that adds up to a number that will take your breath away. To understand how that number is even possible, you need to understand how New York construction bidding works. When a developer wants to build a major project in Manhattan, they issue a request for proposals, a formal competitive bidding process, in which multiple contractors submit cost estimates for the work. In theory, the lowest responsible bid wins. In practice, in the world Ricciardi controlled, the bid process was theater. The outcome had already been determined. The winning contractor had agreed to pay the rate. The losing contractors had agreed to submit bids that were deliberately high enough to lose, but not so obviously inflated that the developer would suspect collusion. The losing contractors were compensated for their participation, with guaranteed subcontracts on future projects. Everyone in the room got something. Everyone in the room was compromised. The developer, who was often also paying the rate, got certainty. The certainty of knowing exactly who was going to build the building, and exactly what the actual labor and material costs were going to be. In a market as volatile and relationship-dependent as New York construction, that kind of certainty has real value. The 18% was not experienced by everyone who paid it as pure extortion. For some of them, it was a business arrangement. That is the most corrosive part of the story. Now understand what this required. It was not simply extortion in the old-fashioned sense, a man showing up at your door with a threat. This was a system. A functional criminal ecosystem that required participation at multiple levels. You needed construction company executives willing to route payments through shell companies. You needed union officials willing to look the other way or actively enforce the Colombo rate on their members. You needed city building inspectors willing to certify work they had not properly inspected. You needed bankers and financial professionals who could move money without leaving trails. And you needed someone at the top, someone with the organizational authority to make and enforce the rules. Vincent Ricciardi was that person. He ran the system. He was the price. And for years, the system ran without serious interruption. Here is where Teresa Whitmore enters the story. Whitmore was an FBI financial crimes analyst assigned to the New York field office. In 2015, she was working a routine assignment, reviewing suspicious activity reports filed by financial institutions. SARS, suspicious activity reports, are documents that banks are legally required to file when they notice transactions that look unusual. A wire transfer to a foreign account from a business that has no obvious international connections, a cash deposit that does not fit the income profile of the account holder, that kind of thing. What Whitmore noticed was a pattern. Over the course of about 8 months in 2015, she flagged a cluster of SARs that all had something in common. They involved New York City construction companies making payments to Delaware, limited liability companies that had no apparent business purpose, no website, no employees, no office, and no history. The LLCs had names like Skyline Legacy Holdings, Atlantic Basin Partners, Metropolitan Structure Group. They sounded like real companies. They were not real companies. They were shells. The payments were not tiny. The smallest was just over $100,000. The largest was close to $600,000. And they were recurring, the same construction companies making payments to the same shells on a quarterly or semi-annual schedule. Whitmore pulled the corporate records for the shells. Delaware, dissolved or inactive. Registered agents that were themselves registered agents for hundreds of other companies. The kind of layered opacity that is the signature of deliberate concealment. She wrote a memo. She flagged it to her supervisor, and the memo found its way to Special Agent David Caruso, who ran the C-16 unit, the Colombo squad, at the New York field office. Caruso had been working organized crime for 11 years. He looked at Whitmore's memo and he saw something he recognized immediately. The shell company structure, the construction sector, the Brooklyn and Queens home, addresses associated with some of the beneficial owners. He knew what he was looking at. He did not know who was at the top yet, but he knew what it was. In 2016, the FBI opened a formal investigation. The case number that would eventually become Operation Clean Foundation was assigned. A task force was assembled. FBI agents from C-16, detectives from the NAPD Organized Crime Investigation Division, IRS Criminal Investigation, and prosecutors from the Eastern District of New York. For the first 2 years, the investigation was almost entirely financial. Tracing money, building the corporate tree, identifying the shell companies. Eventually, 23 Delaware shells that routed money through a correspondent bank in Nevis, a Caribbean financial center known for its bank secrecy laws, and ultimately into a portfolio of Manhattan luxury condominiums. The condos were in buildings whose names you know: 432 Park Avenue, Hudson Yards, 53 West 53rd Street. The financial architecture the task force uncovered was genuinely sophisticated. It was layered, patient, and built around a deep understanding of where law enforcement typically looks and where it does not. The first layer was the shell companies, 23 Delaware LLCs, registered through nominee agents who provided identical boilerplate documentation for hundreds of clients. Delaware requires no disclosure of beneficial owners. An LLC can be formed in a day legally for less than $100, with no requirement to reveal who actually controls it. The second layer was the Nevis Bank. Nevis, a tiny island in the Caribbean, has bank secrecy laws that have long been a destination for funds seeking distance from American regulators. The third layer was the real estate. Luxury condominiums in New York City are among the most effective money laundering vehicles available. Large, enough to absorb significant cash, appreciating assets, and in many cases outside the anti-money laundering reporting requirements that apply to other investment vehicles. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had issued geographic targeting orders for Manhattan luxury real estate since 2016, requiring title insurance companies to report the beneficial owners of cash transactions. The Colombo operation had partially adapted to this. Some of the later purchases used financing to avoid the all-cash trigger, but the 47 construction projects kept generating cash that needed somewhere to go, and real estate remained the preferred destination. This last one, the apartment at 53 West 53rd Street, was purchased in November of 2019 for $6.2 million in cash, no mortgage, no financing. A cash purchase of a luxury condo in one of the most expensive buildings in New York City. The buyer of record was an LLC. The beneficial owner of that LLC was a foreign national living in Frankfurt, Germany, whose name the FBI would not publicly release until indictment. I spent hours going through the wiretap transcripts, and one exchange kept nagging at me because it captured the casual arrogance of people who believe their system is impenetrable. Two men discussing the Frankfurt purchase, speaking in the kind of oblique language that mob conversations always use. And one of them says, "Nobody looks at who owns the apartment, they look at the mortgage. No mortgage, no paper, no problem." He was not wrong. Exactly. It took the FBI 9 years to unwind the full picture. By 2018, the task force had a solid financial map. They knew money was flowing. They knew roughly where it was going. What they did not yet have was recorded evidence of the racketeering, the actual conversations in which the conspiracy was conducted, the meetings where the rates were set, and the contracts were allocated. They needed ears inside. In 2018, the FBI obtained authorization for a Title III wiretap. This is a federal court order permitting the interception of wire communications, phone, calls in this case. The target was a prepaid cell phone associated with Vincent Ricciardi. Getting the authorization required demonstrating probable cause, which the financial analysis had provided. The wiretap went live in the spring of 2018. For several months, the recordings were valuable, not as courtroom-ready evidence of the highest-level conspiracy. Ricciardi was careful on the phone, speaking in the clipped, elusive language of a man who has spent decades as being aware that phones can be tapped, but as intelligence, as a way of identifying other players, mapping relationships, understanding the scheduling of the meetings at the Bath Beach Social and Athletic Club. The recorded calls from this period, which appear in redacted form in the sentencing documents, reveal a man who is simultaneously cautious and completely confident. He talks about projects without naming them. This refers to that, the thing on the west side, the big one downtown. He talks about money in the language of construction. Materials, overhead, the cost of doing business. He never says 18%. He never says tribute. He never says the Colombo family. To someone without context, the calls sound like a contractor discussing his schedule. To the FBI analysts who had the financial map in front of them, every oblique reference clicked into a specific project, a specific payment, a specific shell company. The wiretap was building the key that would translate the public-facing language of legitimate business into the private language of organized crime. And then in the fall of 2018, something went wrong. The wiretap nearly burned. A source inside the investigation, the FBI has never publicly identified who or how, provided information to Ricciardi's associates, suggesting that law enforcement was monitoring certain communications. The FBI got wind of this security breach, and they had a decision to make: pull the wiretap before it was discovered, or leave it in place and risk having Ricciardi go completely dark if he confirmed the surveillance. They pulled it. 2 weeks before, what the task force believed was going to be a significant meeting at the social club. A meeting at which, based on intercepts, Ricciardi was planning to discuss the terms for at least 3 new Manhattan projects. 3 years had now passed since Teresa Whitmore filed her first memo. The task force had financial intelligence, partial wiretap intelligence, and a structural understanding of the conspiracy. What they did not have was a cooperating witness inside the operation. What they did not have was someone who could walk into a room, record what was said, and then testify to it in court. Without that, the case against the top of the conspiracy, against Ricciardi himself, was going to be very difficult to make. 3 years now passed without a cooperating witness. What came next would change everything, and it came from a tax case that had nothing to do with construction. Thomas Galento was 58 years old in 2021. He ran a business called TG Concrete Supply, out of a yard in Queens. He was not a mob figure. He was not a made man. He was a contractor, a concrete contractor who had spent 30 years doing business in the New York construction market, which meant 30 years of navigating the informal system that Ricciardi and the Colombo family controlled. He paid the rates, not because he wanted to, but because in the world he worked in, you paid the rates or you did not get the work. That was the reality. In October of 2021, Thomas Galento was convicted of tax evasion. Not connected to the construction racketeering, this was a separate matter, unreported income over a 7-year period. He was looking at a sentencing recommendation of 30 to 37 months in federal prison. His attorney began preliminary conversations with prosecutors. The prosecutors already knew who Galento was. His name had appeared in the financial records traced files. Though not as a central figure, he was a payer, not a collector. But he was in the room. He had been in the room for years. On December 14, 2021, Thomas Galento signed a cooperation agreement with the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. He agreed to provide information about the construction racketeering scheme, to wear a recording device at meetings with targets of the investigation, and to testify truthfully at any resulting trial. In return, prosecutors agreed to recommend a substantially reduced sentence for his tax conviction. His FBI handler was Special Agent David Caruso. His codename in the files was Source Carpenter. The designation was not accidental. Galento worked with concrete. His testimony would be the foundation that the case was built on. In the beginning, the cooperation produced almost nothing usable. For 8 months after Galento signed his agreement, through the spring and into the summer of 2022, the recordings he made were background intelligence at best. He was attending meetings, he was having conversations, he was wearing the wire as instructed, but the conversations were guarded. The principals, the people the task force actually needed to hear, were not speaking freely around Galento. He was a concrete contractor. He was not a made member. In the hierarchy of the Colombo operation, he was a customer, and customers were not invited into the rooms where the real decisions were made. The task force was patient, but the agents were frustrated. Caruso would later describe this period in an interview as the grind, long enough to make you question whether a given source is ever going to deliver, short enough that you are not ready to give up. Galento kept going back. He kept attending the meetings he was invited to, the social events on the periphery of the organization, the lunches and dinners that were not ostensibly criminal, but that were the connective tissue of the whole operation. He was building trust slowly, the way trust actually builds in that world. Through presence, through reliability, through not asking questions you are not supposed to ask. And then, in August of 2022, something broke open. Robert Ferrante was the chief financial officer of Meridian Steel Group. a publicly traded construction and engineering company based in Manhattan with $240 million in annual revenue. Ferrante was 54 years old, lived in Westchester, drove a German car, had 2 children in private school, and sat on the board of 2 nonprofits. He was, by any external measure, a successful and respectable senior executive at a major American company. He was also, according to the federal indictment, the primary corporate conduit through which Colombo family tribute payments were routed. For years, Meridian Steel had structured its bidding on Manhattan projects to incorporate the 18% rate. The payments went through the shell companies. The shell companies moved money to Nevis. Ferrante knew all of it. Ferrante had, according to prosecutors, personally attended meetings with Ricciardi, not at the Bath Beach Social Club, but at a restaurant in Dyker Heights that Ricciardi's crew used for business meetings with corporate figures who did not want to be seen going to Bath Beach. What's most surprising about this case isn't that a construction company was involved. It's the specific profile of Robert Ferrante. He was not a coerced participant. He was not a small business owner who paid the rate because the alternative was too frightening. He was a CFO of a publicly traded company, a man with fiduciary duties to shareholders, who had apparently decided that the Colombo rate was simply a cost of doing business in New York, and that the market advantage it provided, the guarantee of winning contracts on rigged bids, was worth the risk. That calculation, made in boardrooms and on spreadsheets, is in some ways more disturbing than the extortion itself. On the night of August 11, 2022, Thomas Galento, source carpenter, was seated at a table in the back room of a restaurant in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn. 12 men were present. Vincent Ricciardi was at the head of the table. Robert Ferrante was 2 seats to his left. The occasion was described in the FBI's case notes as a working dinner. The subject of the dinner was a new project, a residential tower at 260 11th Avenue in Hudson Yards, a 38-story mixed-use development with an estimated construction value of $312 million. Galento had a recording device on his body. It was recording everything. Ferrante, according to the transcript, discussed the project in detail: the bid timeline, the projected labor costs, the structural requirements, the competing bids from 3 other firms, and then he and Ricciardi discussed the allocation, which subcontractors would get which pieces, what the Colombo rate would be on this particular project, how the payments would flow. Ricciardi was recorded saying, "He knows what the building is worth. He knows what we're worth. The price is the price. It's not personal. It's overhead." Later in the same conversation, discussing the reliability of the broader system, Ricciardi said, "The locals are paid. The inspectors are paid. The CFOs are in. This doesn't fail unless somebody makes it fail." Somebody had in fact already made it fail. Thomas Galento was sitting at the table, recording every word. What exact lie was on that recording? The complete answer is in the indictment, which runs to 216 pages. But the core of it, the part that made this a case the FBI could take to trial with confidence, was those 2 exchanges. Ricciardi's voice on tape explicitly confirming that building inspectors were on the payroll. Ricciardi's voice on tape discussing the contract allocation for a specific project with the CFO of a publicly traded company. That recording was, in the language of federal criminal practice, devastating. One detail that stayed with me reading through the forfeiture documents: the recording from the Dyker Heights dinner was made on a Tuesday night. By Thursday morning, the task force had listened to it in full. Caruso later described receiving the call from his surveillance team as the moment the case changed. Not the moment it started. They had been building for 7 years at that point, but the moment everyone in the room knew it was over for Ricciardi. The question was no longer whether they had a case. The question was when to move. The answer to that question took almost 2 more years, and that gap nearly cost them everything. Here's the take that will probably get us some argument. The criminal penalties in this case were not commensurate with the harm caused. $2.6 billion in rigged contracts, $410 million in recovered assets, leaving nearly $700 million unaccounted for. 22 years for Ricciardi sounds like a serious number, and it is. But when you work through the math of what was stolen, what was laundered, what was invested in luxury real estate and sheltered in Caribbean banks, and spent on a lifestyle built entirely on the systematic corruption of public infrastructure, the sentences feel calibrated to deter individuals, rather than to disgorge the full benefit of the crime. Ricciardi served 9 years of exposure for every year of his sentence. Ferrante, at 11 years, paid roughly 50 cents in prison time for every $1 million his company processed through the conspiracy. We are not arguing for vengeance. We are observing that when the math works this favorably for the defendant, rational actors will continue to do the math. In 2023 and into 2024, the task force continued building. They had the Dyker Heights recording. They had Galento's testimony about dozens of other meetings. They had the financial architecture fully mapped. But Caruso and the prosecutors wanted to be sure. They wanted the arrest sweep to be clean, the indictment to be airtight, and the number of defendants to be complete enough that no one significant could claim they were overlooked. The viewers who have followed federal racketeering cases before know that this phase of an investigation, the period between having enough evidence to charge and actually charging, is one of the most consequential and least discussed aspects of how these cases work. Every month the task force waited, Galento was still at risk. Every month they waited, there was a chance someone in the operation would flip first and potentially complicate the picture. Every month they waited, evidence aged, witnesses' memories became less sharp, and the possibility that some procedural error in the wiretap authorization would surface and require remediation increased. The prosecutors were balancing certainty against risk. They wanted a case that would not just get convictions. They wanted a case that would not require a trial, because a trial meant Galento testifying in open court, which meant his identity as source carpenter would become public record. The cooperation agreement had provisions for this contingency, but provisions are not the same as solutions. The decision to move in October 2024 was in part a calculated bet that the evidence was strong enough that every defendant would plead rather than face trial. That bet turned out to be correct. Not a single defendant went to trial. Among the 82 defendants were 3 union local presidents from District Council 9 of the painters and allied trades. These were not peripheral figures. They were the men whose control over labor gave the Colombo rate its enforcement mechanism. Without the ability to threaten slowdowns, work stoppages, or sudden inspections by union safety officials, the 18% demand was just a demand. With cooperative union presidents, it was a law of physics in New York construction. There was also Carlo Messina. Messina was a Department of Buildings inspector with 15 years on the job. A city employee, a civil servant, a man who had taken an oath to certify that buildings met the structural standards required to protect the people who would work and live in them. According to the indictment, Messina had accepted $32,000 in cash in 4 separate payments to sign off on a structural certification for a 31-story Midtown office tower. The certification confirmed that the building's steel connections met code. Messina's had not conducted the full inspection required. The building was built. People were working in it right now. And there was the foreign national in Frankfurt whose shell company had been used to purchase the 53 West 53rd Street condominium. The FBI had coordinated with German authorities. An arrest warrant had been issued through Interpol channels. In the spring of 2024, Ricciardi began changing his patterns. He stopped going to the Bath Beach Social and Athletic Club on his regular schedule. He stopped using the phones the FBI had associated with him. He began traveling to meetings by car rather than on foot, with what appeared to be a rotating pattern of routes. The task force noted all of this. The operational security ramp-up was a familiar signal. Either Ricciardi suspected he was being watched, or someone in his circle had told him something concerning. The window was closing. The decision was made in late summer 2024. Move before the end of the year. FBI Assistant Director Mara Halligan, who had oversight of the operation, approved the arrest timeline in September. October 3rd, 2024 was selected as the sweep date. 341 agents and detectives, 18 staging locations, 82 arrest warrants, 96 search warrants, and 17 asset seizure orders executed simultaneously. The coordination required was extraordinary. You cannot arrest 82 people simultaneously across 4 states and 3 countries without the logistical precision of a military operation. Each target had a dedicated team. Each team had a primary and a backup arrest location. Communications were on encrypted FBI channels. No information about the specific targets or timing was shared outside the task force until 48 hours before execution. And even then, only the agents directly involved in each arrest were briefed on their specific target. At 6:07 in the morning on October 3rd, Special Agent Patricia Hennessy placed Vincent Ricciardi under arrest at his Bay Ridge Parkway home. He said nothing. He was processed, transported, and arraigned. He did not request bail because his attorney already knew it would be denied. At 6:22, in a Westchester County suburb, agents knocked on Robert Ferrant's door. He answered in a bathrobe. According to the agents present, he looked at the badges, looked at the warrant, and said, "My attorney's number is on the kitchen counter." He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily composed for a man whose life was about to be dismantled. He was processed and transported to the Southern District of New York. At 8:15 in the morning at a coffee shop on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, agents approached Carlo Messina as he was finishing his second espresso. Messina looked up, looked at the agents, and said, "I know why you're here." He did not resist. He stood up, finished the espresso. There are reports that he did this deliberately, though this has not been confirmed, and walked out with the agents. In Boca Raton, Florida, at 4:15 in the afternoon, Anthony Saporito, the president of one of the District Council 9 locals, was arrested at the pool of a resort where he was on vacation. By the time agents reached him, he had already received a call from someone in New York alerting him that arrests were happening. He had not fled, which his attorney would later argue was evidence of his good faith. Prosecutors would argue it was evidence that he had nowhere to go. In Frankfurt, German federal police, coordinating with the FBI through the Department of Justice's Office of International Affairs, arrested the foreign national at his residence. He was extradited to the United States 42 days later. Now, what about those 3 defendants not arrested on October 3rd? This was a question that surfaced in the press coverage and never got a clean answer. Here is what the public record shows. One defendant, identified in the indictment as John Doe 17, had not been located at his listed address when agents arrived at 6 in the morning. He was arrested 48 hours later at his sister's home in Queens. A second defendant, a financial professional who had served as a nominee, officer for several of the Delaware shell companies, reached a proffer agreement with prosecutors 12 days after the sweep and self-surrendered. The third was the Frankfurt defendant, who, as noted, was extradited 42 days after the initial arrests. All 3 were eventually in custody. None fled, none disappeared. The 42-day Frankfurt extradition is worth noting specifically because international extraditions in white-collar cases can take years. The cooperation between the FBI and German federal authorities, the Bundeskriminalamt, was extensive and had been developed over the course of the investigation. When the arrest warrant was issued, the German side was ready to execute. The foreign national, whose shell company had received money from 5 of the Delaware LLCs, and whose personal benefit from the scheme was estimated at between $8 and $12 million, did not contest extradition. His attorney later indicated that he had understood, once the indictment was filed, that contesting would be futile and would only delay a resolution that was coming regardless. He pleaded guilty to money laundering conspiracy and received a sentence of 6 years and 3 months. We have gotten a version of this question from people who followed our coverage of previous cooperation cases, and we want to address it directly. Was justice actually served here? Or is this a case where the scale of the harm and the years it took to respond mean that no sentence, no forfeiture, no press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse can actually balance the ledger? Think about it this way. The 47 construction projects affected by this conspiracy were built over roughly a decade. The corruption was operational for years before 2015. The money that moved through the shell companies and into Caribbean banks and luxury condominiums represents wealth extracted from the New York City construction economy, wealth that would otherwise have been available for better buildings, more competitive labor rates, more affordable housing units. The FBI made its case. The court imposed serious sentences. The government recovered $410 million. And the system that produced Vincent Ricciardi and the Bath Beach Social and Athletic Club and the 18% rate is still intact. We leave that question open because we do not have a clean answer, and anyone who says they do is not looking at the full picture. Do you think Thomas Galento, source carpenter, made the right call? A 58-year-old concrete contractor, looking at 37 months in prison, decided to spend 31 more months of his life walking into rooms wearing a wire for the FBI. Or do you think the system used him, gave him a deal that required him to take enormous personal risk, and then filed him away when the case was done? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. The pleas and sentencings unfolded over the following months. Vincent Ricciardi entered a guilty plea on April 9, 2025. Before Judge Elena Morales of the Eastern District of New York, he admitted to racketeering conspiracy, extortion, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. He is 62 years old. He will be 84 if he serves the full term. Robert Ferrante negotiated a plea in early 2025. He received 11 years and was ordered to forfeit $43 million, representing his personal benefit from the scheme. as calculated by the government's forensic accountants. Meridian Steel Group, the publicly traded company he had served as CFO, entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, $214 million in civil penalties, 3 years of compliance monitoring, and mandatory restructuring of its procurement practices. The company is still operating. Its stock dropped significantly on the day the indictment was announced, then partially recovered. Carlo Messina received 4 years and 9 months. The $32,000 he accepted to certify a building he had not properly inspected was the number the press focused on. But the sentencing memo noted that Messina had conducted at least 9 irregular certifications over his 15-year career, 9 buildings. The structural deficiencies, if any, are currently being audited by the Department of Buildings. The 3 union local presidents received sentences ranging from 6 to 9 years, depending on their individual culpability and whether they had cooperated in any capacity with prosecutors. Thomas Galento, source carpenter, was sentenced to time served plus 3 years of supervised release for his original tax evasion conviction. He did not receive a new identity. He did not enter witness protection. He returned, as best the public record indicates, to his life in Queens. TG Concrete Supply was dissolved in 2023, while he was still cooperating. Whether he was still in the concrete business after the case concluded is not something the public record addresses. By June of 2025, $410 million in assets had been recovered and forfeited to the United States government out of the $1.1 billion target identified in the seizure orders. The gap, nearly $700 million, represents assets that moved before the seizure orders could reach them, assets held by nominees in jurisdictions with limited cooperation with U.S. law enforcement, and assets that the government has traced but not yet converted to cash. The 53 West 53rd Street condominium was auctioned in March of 2025 for $7.8 million, $600,000 more than the original 2019 purchase price. Even after 6 years of legal proceedings, the proceeds went to the Federal Asset Forfeiture Fund. What strikes us about this case is precisely that evolution from a suspicious activity report flagged by a single analyst in a back office in 2015 to a 9-year operation that dismantled a criminal ecosystem embedded so deeply in the infrastructure of New York City that the city's own inspectors, its own union leadership, its own corporate boardrooms were compromised. Teresa Whitmore, the analyst who started it, has never given a public interview. Caruso testified at the sentencing proceedings that the case represented the most complex financial investigation his unit had ever conducted. Mara Halligan, announcing the arrests on October 3rd, said that the 47 buildings whose construction had been corrupted by this scheme were a reminder that organized crime's costs are not abstract, they are structural, literal, and load-bearing. One detail that stayed with me reading through all of this: among the 47 projects rigged by the Colombo operation, at least 3 were affordable housing developments. City-subsidized projects, taxpayer money, buildings meant to house New Yorkers who could not afford the market rate. The 18% tribute was collected on those projects, too. The cost was passed on to the city. The city passed it on to taxpayers. The people who were supposed to benefit from those housing units got fewer units, or smaller units, or units with structural certifications signed by a man who was getting paid in cash to not look too closely. That is what organized crime costs. Not just in dollars, in apartments that do not exist. This case is closed. The arrests are made. The sentences are handed down. The shells are dissolved and the condos are auctioned. But the 47th project is still standing. The 9th irregular certification is still being audited. And somewhere in the construction supply chain of the largest city in America, the systems that made this possible, the opacity of Delaware LLCs, the weakness of beneficial ownership disclosure, the cash economy of certain inspection regimes, those systems are still in place. If you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that we do not do endings that tie everything into a bow, because the bow is a lie. The Colombo family ran construction racketeering in New York City for decades. This operation took 9 years and 1 cooperative concrete contractor to dismantle one piece of it. The Windows case of 1990 was described at the time as the case that would clean up New York construction. 34 years later, Operation Clean Foundation was described in almost exactly the same terms. We will see. If you want to understand how this kind of case gets built from a financial analyst's memo to a multi-year wiretap operation, subscribe. We cover federal investigations with the same level of detail you just heard. We go into the financial architecture. We go into the cooperation dynamics. we go into what actually happens in the courtroom. There are more cases like this one. Some of them are still under investigation right now, and when they break, we will be here. Hit to subscribe. Leave a comment about Thomas Galento, or about the sentences, or about what you think is still happening in that construction supply chain. We read every comment, and we will see you in the next one.